Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to hear this talk. I'd also like to thank the organisers of Devox UK for asking me to come and give what must have looked to them like an unknown quantity. This talk. Actually, it was originally scheduled for late on tomorrow, presumably when everybody had gone home. But I had to reschedule to today. So it's going to be an interesting experiment to see what happens. I'm talking about moving fast and breaking everything, which you'll know is adapted from the famous Facebook slogan. And it's about the impact of information technology on today's society, which turns out to be quite a big topic. So this is me, and I usually put this slide up to kind of cover my insecurity and say, oh, look, I've done all of these things. But actually, I know what you really think when you see this. What you really think is you see this, you see somebody who looks like this, and you think, that guy is old. Right? Okay, you can't deny it, can you? So this talk is actually given partly from the perspective of somebody who's very old. I've been around for long enough that I've actually seen, I've almost seen the computing industry grow from not nothing. I'll talk about what it was, but grown certainly in terms of the impact that it has on our lives. From virtually nothing to what it is today. And nowadays I notice that when people talk about the future of artificial intelligence, they typically say, well, artificial intelligence is just going through its maturing stages now, machine learning will be really effective in the next 10 years or so, something like that. And they say 2050 is going to be the date of the big breakthrough. 2050, 30 years' time. So, like for most people in this room, I think you probably, median age will be somewhere in your 30s. You've got every prospect of seeing 2050. I just for the sake of a little amusement, I asked a statistician friend of mine what my chances are of seeing 2050, and it comes out as something less than 3%. So I'm quite interested in what's going to happen, but you should be more interested because. Yeah, so one characteristic of being old, it's partly a disadvantage, but it's also partly an advantage, is that I think you probably maybe experienced. Some people will be experiencing this already. You always see the world. Through the eyes, through the framework that you had when you were in your late teens or early 20s. So you can actually change your ideas. I hope we don't stay totally static. But the world that the fixed framework of the world through which we view things is around about when we were 20. I heard that Napoleon said, "This is how you understand a person. Look at what the world was like when they were 20." I couldn't track the quote down, but it sounds good to me. So I sort of thought, well, what was happening when I was in my late teens or early 20s? Because I didn't want to stick to exactly the year. Some really strange things happened. They look strange to us now. That is a picture of the publicity campaign for the first credit card in the UK. It was a Barclay card, and it was actually 1966 it was sent out. It was launched, and it was mailed out at random to 1 million people through the post. Right? You just got a Barclay card. It's kind of hard to imagine that. Other things happened that you didn't necessarily see the significance of. So this is an advert from 1967. An instant cash machine. It says, "Whatever next." Right? As I say, you get used to things eventually. So I'm kind of used to cash machines by now. Something else happened. Actually, something happened right on the point when I was 20. This happened. So you remember weird things, and you remember things you can hardly believe. But most of all, you remember all those missed investment opportunities. Can anybody guess what that is? It's a chip, right enough. Yeah. Can you guess which chip it was? No, it's not a fair question, really. It's an Intel 4004, and it was the first Intel microprocessor. It was launched in 1971, and at that time, there was about 2,000 computers. There was about 2,000 British-designed computers in the UK. That was the nearest figure I could track down as to the number of computers there were altogether. Well, British-designed computers were quite a big deal, actually, at that time. There was a kind of vibrant British computer industry. But if I'd have had any sense, I would, of course, have invested in that guy. Well, I have a terrible record as a futurologist, so I'm here now. Other ways in which the world has changed are you can't sort of illustrate so easily in terms of product launches. One of them was that information, compared to nowadays, information was a really, really scarce resource. So this was something I'd have really liked to have had. This is the Encyclopedia Britannica. I can't remember how many volumes there are to that. It's a lot. 30 volumes, and it was a very expensive thing. Very few people had it, and as a teenager, I would have just absolutely loved to have that, because there's so much knowledge contained in it. It cost about $3,000 in today's money, something like that. And people they were sold around the door and by door-to-door salesmen, and you bought them on installments. Hardly anybody could afford to buy them. So the reason I showed that is because one aspect of being old is that not only do you see things through the eyes of your 20-year-old self, but you also, in my experience, contrary to the cliche, you can become more curious. You keep on asking, why is the world the way it is? Because it is so different from the way it was when, as you can see from these kind of faded sepia pictures. Why? Not only, obviously we know that it's different because information technology and the chip has kind of exponentially grown in power and all that. But why does it happen in this particular way? Did it have to be like this, or could it have been different? And what exactly is the way that it's happened? So one thing is that we do have Wikipedia, for example. Nobody's going to buy 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica for they stopped printing it, by the way, only recently. Nobody's going to pay $3,000 for that. So as a young person, I would have dreamed of having something like Wikipedia online. That would have been absolutely fantastic to me. There was a huge hunger for information, which nowadays is kind of hard to think about. There was a huge hunger for news. Interestingly, I remember a journalist strike in the early 1970s, and I was working on a fringe newspaper at the time. And we were really desperate to get copies out because we thought it was going to sell so well, because there was this thing called news hunger. If you didn't have newspapers, you could listen to the radio, and of course there was the television, but that didn't have any depth at the time. So information was this really scarce resource, and somebody like me grew up really desperate to suck in as much of it as we could do. And one other thing that I would have really liked to have had when I was younger, because I was a political activist, and I was trying to organize people to do political things, and telling people where there was a meeting or a demonstration or something was incredibly difficult. You had to either write to them, send them a letter, or you had to phone them up on their landline and try and catch them in. And the dream of being able to contact them, just send them a message was like something that was science fiction. So I'm mentioning these things because some of them have worked out really well for us. Some of them are actually quite strange. It's all got a lot more complicated. When I started to write this talk, I thought, well, I'll talk about those sorts of things and how that's changed. And I made up a mind map of how I thought tech was impacting on society. And after a while, I gave up because it started to look like this. And clearly, you're not going to get this in a 40-minute talk. So it's kind of ridiculously ambitious to pretend that I'm going to talk about the impact of technology on modern society, because there's just so many different aspects of it. I'm going to try and trace one path through this complicated cat's cradle of effects. I still have the background that I had as a political activist, so I still tend to think that economics leads. I think people are primarily motivated by material factors. But I've felt that fading in recent years. We've seen things like the recent political developments in which people seem to have voted and seem to be very enthusiastic against their own economic interests. So I'm not going to talk quite so much in terms of some kind of economic determinism that motivates things. But all the same, there are some things that we can be certain of. Humans create technology, obviously, but then after that, technology changes humans. So a couple of examples before I get on to IT, just to show how profound that effect is. The invention of fire was a really significant aspect of human development. It's the only one in which that has taken place in an evolutionary time, so that our physiology has actually changed as a result of having fire. Humans are kind of born of fire rather than as much as the other way around. Being able to control fire meant that you could have cooked food, and having cooked food meant that you would get a lot more energy out of the food because you could digest it much more easily, and that meant more energy for your brain, and it also meant that you could have smaller jaws, and that left, to put it bluntly, more room in your head for a larger brain. So actually humans are a result of fire, of controlling fire, almost as much as fire is a result of the control of fire was a result of what humans did. So that was the last time, probably, the last time that we can be sure that human physiology was affected by technology. But human culture and political development and psychology has continued to be affected, and that evolves much more rapidly, obviously, than our physiology. So an example of that is writing. This is a cuneiform pictograph from southern Iraq around about 3000 BC, and it's about the allocation. It records the allocation of beer, which is obviously important in those days. And writing was originally invented for people to be able to do trade. Basically, it was an accounting tool to start off with, and so it allowed development of economics. But economics, in turn, allowed and large-scale trading over long distances and over long periods of time, which can be recorded in writing much more reliably than it can be remembered. That led to much larger-scale organizations. So you got these large political empires. And when I say political, of course, I also mean military. And so it really changed the way people thought about the world. It changed psychology. And interestingly, the writing, you could say, came to reshape reality because, again, in the same kind of way as the invention of fire changed humans, writing changed reality. When the Doomsday Book was written, this inventory of Norman England, a commentator said not long afterwards, it said, "This is it. This is how things are. Its sentence cannot be quashed or set aside. Its decisions, like that of the Last Judgment, are unalterable." So it actually came to be to override reality, and that's an example of the effect in which technology, or the way in which technology can actually change reality. And my last example, before I get on to talking about IT, you'll be pleased to hear, is about railways. Railways are, these are chosen kind of at random. They're technologies that change the world, but they're quite different from IT in various ways. Writing is extremely pervasive. Eventually, after a very long period, everybody can write, and everybody's affected by writing. Railways, not so much, but they did change the world enormously. Obviously, they changed it economically in a big way. They changed it in terms of culture. People started to think about entire countries in a way that they hadn't done before. So, for example, time zones were a result of railways. Railway timetables couldn't any longer be synchronized just to local solar time, which people had always used before that. Railway runs west to east; it's got to be running within defined time zones. So that changed. And of course, in the case of somewhere like the United States, the railway actually sort of created the country, and so you got a politics out of that. And again, I have to say that once again, politics includes military activities as well, because railways transformed what could be done in wars. There's an interesting commentary that I came across when I was finding this picture about moral panics that accompany the introduction of new technologies. And that is very relevant for today. So when railways were introduced, people thought that this was, well, people, I say certain people, namely the male half of the population, I guess, or the authoritative half, thought that railways weren't safe for women because women couldn't travel at more than 50 miles an hour. It would be fatal to them. And they thought, interestingly, that their uteruses would fly out if they went too fast. So that was, that's quite a particularly interesting kind of panic. It wasn't like they would faint or that they wouldn't be able to breathe or something like that. It was their sex organs that would fail. So all this is interesting, but it's a bit beside the point when what we want to talk about is IT. So let's have a look at that. How does IT differ from writing in railways? Well, in various ways, obviously. And IT is a really interesting. It's an interesting technology from our point of view because it's so much more pervasive, it's so much more adaptable, it's dynamic in a way that none of these were. And I'm going to go on to talk about those things. But I want to start off by talking about an idea that comes, I have to say, from I didn't invent it. It comes from a book that was recently published about the effect of particularly of social media on politics, and the idea of it is that an experiment has been devised called the Impulsivity training device. Right? So it's a book by a guy called James Williams, which I'll reference at the end there. So the idea of this is that it's going to be based on informational rewards. And the informational rewards will be cat pictures, things that get you excited and outraged in various ways, communication with your social circle, anything that gives you an immediate reward. And we're going to build an economic sector. In this experiment, we're going to build an economic sector based on creating these informational rewards. We'll make this device small enough to be always present on you. And we'll see what happens. We'll run this experiment for 10 years, and we'll see what happens. And it's likely that what would happen at the end of that time is it would have near universal adoption, and everybody who had it would be using it all the time. So it would really change the world in a very big way, and it would change people's psychology in a really big way. So he ends up by saying, Williams in the book ends up by saying, of course, the iTrainer project would never come anywhere anywhere close to passing a research ethics review. Launching such a project of societal reshaping and letting it run unchecked would clearly be utterly outrageous. So it's a good thing that it's all just a thought experiment. So what is it that? Why? I'm tackling this big question from one small angle, and the angle of social media and your phone. So what's going on here? Well, your attention is very valuable. I mean, it turns out your attention is very valuable. Here's one particular economic model, one business model of how revolutionary IT can be imported into our lives, really almost overnight, and it's via advertising. So your attention. They often say, of course, that if you're getting something for free, then you're the product. That's commonly said. But it's actually not that you so much of the product. Your attention is the product. Your attention is very valuable. I like this quote from Jeff Hammerbacher, Facebook's first research scientist. But I haven't put the whole ad on. I haven't put the whole quote on. The best minds of my generation, he said, are thinking about how to make people click ads, and it sucks. So that was his view after he left Facebook, of course. You couldn't say that when you were there. But I like this one even more. At Netflix, we're competing for our customers' time. So our competitors include Snapchat, YouTube, Sleep, etc. And that's the CEO of Netflix. And if you look at the way that our information devices are structured, this first quote's really relevant because they use lots and lots of psychological cues that are designed to grab our attention, and they're designed for good evolutionary grounds. Here's a blow up on my my mail icon. See that red blob is designed in evolutionary terms. There's a big advantage to responding to a red blob. That's liable to be very meaningful. And of course, we know about the other ways in which, many other ways in which our information devices have ways of attracting our attention, and how effective those things are. There's something I saw a report of something called email apnea. I don't know if you're used to this idea. You know, apnea is this thing where you stop breathing in your sleep because your throat passage closes. It's not fatal, but it's kind of quite frightening for somebody to listen to it. It's like you gasp and you don't breathe for a while. Well, email apnea is if when you bring up that icon, it says you've got 4,789 messages that you need to process. I had an interesting experience this morning, I have to say. I put this slide in at the last minute. To distract myself, because distractions are a very big part of this deal, to distract myself from preparing this talk, I took a look at The Guardian. So, and this morning in The Guardian, George Monbiot, who I'm an enthusiastic follower of, he's a writer about ecology, had a piece about what's happening to fish and how actually the oceans are being emptied. I'm really quite interested in this. I'm quite motivated about it, and I'm sympathetic to the problem. And I don't want to give up eating fish, but I want to know about it. And he starts off by saying, this is the most important news humanity's ever received, the report that came out about the collapse of ecosystems all over the world. I've just highlighted, and then he's complaining that it hasn't been publicized. And then I've highlighted this sentence saying the media bias is that they distract you with this bias against relevance. And he says, and he goes on to say something, that I sympathise with, because if you actually understood what the issues were, if they let you understand what the issues were, you would try to do something about it. He says, so they distract us with baubles such as a royal baby and a dispute between people about their patio. And he says, and he goes on to complain about the media, and the rest of the article is about the fish. So what do you think I did when I read this piece? No. I clicked on the link about the neighbours and the patio. And then I thought, what? But I actually did that. Obviously, what I'm saying here is that I think these effects work on you. Lots of people say, "Oh, I never look at adverts," and of course, I don't think my attention is so easily distracted. But I'm clearly wrong. Actually, I'm aware, and I know from talking to other people younger than me that my attention span has eroded a lot, and I do think that's the effect of the information overload that I get. I was really keen to have information when I was younger, and I would consume it in a very determined way. But now I'm aware that it's like a fire hose, and I've got to, and no sooner have I finished, or half finished, one item of information, there's going to be something else coming in. I've got to hurry on to that. So I'm going to step back from that now and think, well, how did we come? What's the economic model that meant that this amazing technology that was going to be so wonderful, that was going to allow us to have all this perfect knowledge and was going to allow us to communicate perfectly? Why did it come to us, in fact, in this particular way? Well, the economic adaptation of the system capitalism, to take it all together. The economic adaptation of capitalism to this technology is dependent on partly on the kind of technology it is, and partly on the interests of the people who are introducing it, and obviously have to make money out of it because it's capitalism and you have to make money. So the technology is extraordinary. It's extremely adaptable. It can unlike any previous technology, it can be brought to bear on almost any use case you can imagine. As we know, there's hardly any aspect of our lives that isn't impacted by information technology. It's highly connective, so all of those different applications can be connected together. It can be it has a real-world presence, so this network that is built up, all these connections, can sense the real world and can act on the real world. And it's extraordinarily performant. No technology ever has improved exponentially by a factor of like 1.5 for every 18, or doubled every 18 months for 50 years. And there's never been anything like that in the history of the world. So it's an incredibly powerful tool for transforming the world. And naturally, the economic system has had to adapt to that. So the business models that have grown up in response to that there are some new ones, like advertising, which I've already talked about. And I don't want you to think, you may well say, oh, look, advertising existed already. Like, we had lots of businesses that were supported by advertising. Newspapers were supported by advertising. It was a poster business. Television was supported by advertising. But I want to emphasize that the kind of advertising that we have now is different, is qualitatively different from any advertising that's been in the past, in the sense that it's much more highly quantified and measured. So the level of awareness that advertisers have about how effective their advertisements are, how sharply they can target them, how sharply they can target them to a particular demographic. So it's no longer saying, oh, I'll put an advert in the newspaper. You know a great deal about the person you're aiming the advert at, and you know how effective it's been. And you can do A/B testing to refine to an extreme degree the sort of your message. And so suddenly advertising has become not simply the kind of, it was like prehistory days when you put a poster up beside the road, on a billboard beside the road, or put an advert in a newspaper. This is space age advertising compared to Stone Age advertising. So it's it's really a very different model. So that's one business model for businesses nowadays using IT. Another one are lean platforms. And obviously, everyone's aware of those. Lean platforms is kind of code for things like Airbnb and Uber. Enterprises that don't own anything, that are mediators in the gig economy, effectively, or it doesn't have to be the gig economy, but it often is. They're go-betweens, and they connect people. So that's a model whose long-term sustainability is by no means certain. Uber has never yet made any money. It's about to have a massive IPO, and it's quite interesting that the documents for the IPO don't talk about making money. They really don't. They're not actually suggesting that investors should buy Uber shares because they're going to get a return on them. They say, well, we're going to transform the industry. We're going to transform life. They are not yet about making money. So these platforms may or may not last in the long term. There's also been a huge impact on existing business models. We don't hear so much about those because they're not kind of so spectacular. One example is product transformation. So products are now sold as things that were products before are now sold as services. An example, the kind of classic example that everybody uses for this is jet engines. So jet engines are a commodity, or were a commodity. But a jet engine now is not just a propulsion mechanism for an aeroplane. It's a data collecting device. They collect massive amounts of information about the performance of the engine, the conditions it's under, what the weather is, air traffic control, and all these kinds of things. Collects an enormous amount of data, which is essential for predicting when maintenance is due and what kind of maintenance is due, because maintenance is now the main business. Say, for example, for Boeing, and a competitor who wants to get into the engine maintenance business clearly is going to be at a huge disadvantage if they don't have that kind of data available. So many products are being transformed in that kind of way. Things are Things that we thought were dead things are now alive with data gathering, and in many cases with activators as well. Another one which you don't hear very much about because it's industry, and if you work in that field that would be something you would know about, but otherwise it's kind of invisible, and that's supply chain integration. There's a huge push on for end-to-end tracking of manufacture and assembly of manufactured goods. So the entire supply chains, say, for example, all this stuff that we've been hearing about in the context of Brexit, about the number of times the parts for a car have to cross the channel backwards and forwards before they're finally finished. This is a product of IT detection. They use RFIDs for tracking the arrival of these things. They use GPS. You use GPSs to track where they are. The whole thing's very, very highly planned. And this supply chain integration is something like I haven't talked so much, say, in terms of advertising. I haven't talked so much in terms of the network itself. I've talked in terms of the business model. But in terms of the network itself, something like Facebook has a huge advantage because of the network effect. Nobody wants to join a new social network which has only got 3 people. You want to join the social network you're interested in is the one that all your friends are in. So supply chain integration will also have that kind of will also have that kind of advantage. Whoever gets there first with supply chain integration will be the winner. So the reason I've talked about these is because I'm kind of going backwards because I was talking about one aspect of the way in which technology has impacted on us, which is this thing about our attention and our psychology. But I wanted to say, well, why are we getting it in that particular way? Well, because these are the business models that work, that will either make money or be attractive to investors, at least, under the present kind of capitalism that we have. What about political impact? So political impact clearly does result from economics, because you now have the wealthiest people in the world are typically people who have profited from the introduction of IT, either into existing businesses or often into new businesses. So these people, Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg and so on, have enormous power because power comes along with wealth, quite obviously. So the political impact it partly derives from the economics, but it also derives as well from the psychological and attentional and cultural changes that we've seen. So one such political impact, and I'll go through these relatively quickly because they're pretty well known. Everybody knows about Twitter, used as a communication mechanism for politicians. But it's a communication mechanism for us, but I'm not thinking about that. I mean, it's highly functional for people in the community, of course. But it's also highly functional in a completely different way for President Trump. So it's in the past, somebody like Trump, in order to talk to people, would have had to, write an article in the newspaper or appear on television or something like that. Now, as everyone knows, his favoured means of communication is Twitter. So think about this for a little. Think about how his message is being delivered. It's extraordinary. The thing that immediately jumps out at me is he can be extremely spontaneous with this. Everyone knows he tweets at 3:00 in the morning with whatever has come into his head, and it's extraordinarily intimate. Right? You can hardly imagine, apart from actually having an earpiece which directly transmitted his thoughts, you could hardly imagine something that would be more intimate than being able to reach out to your bedside table and read what he said a moment ago. Tyrants in the past would have well, they couldn't have killed for it, but they would have killed everybody to get an advantage, a communication advantage like that. So this is a really interesting aspect of this generation of IT, quite unlike anything that we've seen previously. It's right in your life. It's right there. And it's a very direct way of talking to you. So, and influencing you, of course, as well, because you trust things. Typically, you trust things that are very close to you. So the next one is Facebook as a news medium. Now, that's had a huge impact, and I guess you may be aware of this or not, I don't know. There's been a lot of publicity recently around, particularly in this country, the effect that Facebook-transmitted news has had on political decisions. But I think the same thing's happened in other countries as well, but primarily in the United States. So I would strongly recommend to anybody who's interested at all in this talk, or in the subject of the talk, not in the talk itself, to go to YouTube and watch Carol Cadwalader's talk, a TED talk recently, at which she, with the gods of Silicon Valley in the room, she said to them very clearly, Facebook, she said, is an amazing technology, and it is a crime scene. And you, the executives, have the evidence. And immediately, of course, as soon as she got off the stage, the TED was subject to all kinds of complaints about what she said and demands that she retracted it and so forth. But the TED talk is out there. So Carol Cadwalader, as a journalist, has uncovered the enormous amounts of dark money that has flowed into Facebook, and the way in which they've been able, in the way in which firms, in the past Cambridge Analytica, but currently other firms, are able to extract data, a huge amount of data about individuals, and use that to target, not adverts, as I was saying previously, but exactly the same technology works for targeting political messages. And now this is something completely new. This is a political impact that we've never seen before, because now not only is it really targeted, but we don't know, you don't know, I don't know what is being said to those people. And I mean, in some cases, we actually know that they are being lied to in very specific ways that Facebook can tell, or that the Facebook data analysts can tell will work with them, and even. The analysis can even go so far as to distinguish people who are going to be influencers within their community and target them in very specific ways. So this is really a big deal, and this is really changing politics a lot. So another aspect of how political thinking is changing under the influence of this new technology is the amazingly intimate scrutiny that we're now subjecting ourselves to. In many cases, we're subjecting ourselves to it. So you communicate with your friends using these devices. You keep your... I know I do. You keep all your appointments on your calendars. Netflix and YouTube know what entertainment you're watching. Your finances are online. I get my prescriptions for medication over the internet, and so on. So there's a lot of information there, which, of course, I'm hoping is going to be in separate silos. I'm hoping it's not going to be integrated. But increasingly, I'm uncertain that it isn't going to be integrated. So I mean, this is an interesting situation, because in the past, what we've always worried about was government oversight, with the idea that the state was potentially an oppressor, which, if it had enough information, would be able to use that essentially to control us. But it turns out that it's now going into private hands. The state appears to be not a very effective actor in this at all. Zuckerberg, for example, has consistently refused to appear in front of parliamentary and governmental bodies to answer questions about what Facebook is doing, because he can simply ignore them, and he's very powerful. But when he has something when these data titans have something that the governments need, governments will go to them, and then that will be a different story. So there's some kind of quite interesting things happening here, in case you think I'm being paranoid. And I don't want to give too negative a view of the whole picture, because I do think it's a very exciting technology. I think there are many possibilities here that we can use. I mean, we are empowered, I should say, as well as them being empowered by this amazing technology. But just in case you think this is all a fantasy, I should tell you that there is a system has been postulated by which all of your activities that can be logged are being logged, and and some kind of a social credit rating is being created out of this, and that therefore you'll be able to do. You'll be able to take part in certain activities, depending on how good your rating is, and you'll be eligible for certain benefits, and the whole system will be aware of it. And you may think that I'm talking about an episode of Black Mirror, if you have seen an episode of Black Mirror in which that happens, but I'm actually talking about something that the Chinese government is creating. So this is actually under construction at the moment. Of course, that's China, but I think it's. One of the things I say on that mind map is that I think that the best predictor you can get for what is liable to happen, or of one possible scenario of what's liable to happen, is actually science fiction. Science fiction writers have been more accurate. Well, not more accurate, but more visionary and in many cases more perceptive than futurologists. I would always turn to them. So yes, technological unemployment. This is going to be something huge, of course. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail. I've talked too long about things that everybody knows a lot about. But technological employment is going to be a really big thing particularly when machine learning comes in. Self-driving cars alone. Self-driving vehicles alone will put out of work around about 20 million people in the United States. That's an awful lot of people. And the political ramifications of that are going to be enormous. So the things I really wanted to talk about, I'm not left myself a lot of time to talk about, because they kind of are more relevant to us. So normally you don't think that when you write code, you are imposing your power over other people. And of course, we as individuals, it's true that we aren't. But there's actually lots of ways in which you can see that when you've constructed a machine and you demand that people conform to the requirements of that machine, you kind of have done that. So, like in a trivial way, DRM, digital rights management, is kind of a force. It constrains what you can do by force. I mean, it doesn't. Obviously, you aren't punished. Well, actually, you are punished in theory, but in law, if you circumvent it. But in practice, many people just can't circumvent it. So that's exerting power over you. In another kind of at a step up from that, you might think that self-driving cars, for example, if they decide that they are never going to, park on a double yellow line, that is imposing what you might think was a reasonable constraint on you by force. Right? You aren't going to have any choice in the matter. A really interesting one is an example in a book that I'm going to recommend to you at the end, where you might imagine that you've got a robot which can predict what the result of a challenge to a doctor's decision was. So, for example, you go into hospital, and the doctor's trying to decide whether to operate on you or not, and he or she consults this robot. It's like a robot judge, and it says, "Supposing I could do this and I get it wrong, what are the chances that I will be sued for negligence?" Right? So the robot replies, whatever it replies, yes or no. And then the thing goes wrong, and it comes before a court. The judge asks, asks the doctor, did you conform to the decision of this robot judge? And if the doctor says, well, no, I ignored it because I thought it was just a robot judge, he says, well, that was negligent. This robot has got a very good track record of it's irresponsible to pay no attention to it, or irresponsible not to have consulted in the first place. So in a way, the robot judge is now, supposing the robot judge changes its judgment, it is now effectively making the law. And so code is power in the sense that eventually code becomes law. Well, and it can adapt. Algorithmic injustice. So people know quite a lot about this, I guess. Training data bias is really well known. If you train a machine learning system on Caucasian faces, well, then when you present it with non-Caucasian faces, you'll get typically very insulting comments like "this isn't a face," or if it's an Asian face, then why don't you open your eyes, or something of that kind. Maybe categorize non-Caucasian faces as not human. So training data bias is a really big problem. Equally a problem is not just training data bias, but the fact that there's often bias built into real life situations. So that, for example, predictive policing, which is a thing now. Police are sent out to patrol a particular area on the basis that that's an area in which there's likely to be trouble. And it may be that in some cases, it might, I don't know, for example, a predictive policing algorithm could say, well, you should stop and search people in this area. And if somebody challenges that, and there actually have been cases like this involving individuals, right, where somebody said, well, why did you think I was a risk? Why do I have to go down? Why do I have to go to prison for longer on the basis you thought I was a risk? The answer is, well, the algorithm said so. And so you say, how did the algorithm work? Well, it's a neural network. It just works. And so now we have this completely, and this will be increasingly the case, we have these completely non-transparent ways in which power is enforced over people. I mean, that's very interesting, I think. Codifying values. So I really speed up. Codifying values. This is about things like the trolley problem. Everyone know about the trolley problem? I'm seeing some, not everybody's nodding. Okay, so the trolley problem, in short, it's like you're designing a self-driving car, you're imagining a situation in which a child walks in front of the car, and you either run the child over, or you avoid the child and run into another car in which you kill 3 people. Right? So, or 2 people, or something like that. So there's a million such situations in which you have to make value judgments. Whose life is worth more than whose other life? And that's going to be codified as a program. Right? And when you get into the car, you may well not know what the decision was of the programmer when they had to do that. That must be happening already in the design of autonomous vehicles. Okay, where are we going? So that's my really brief summary, not brief enough, of the kind of some of the picture of where we are. Where are we going? Well, I'm kind of a pessimist. So I no, you picked that up. I don't want to give an altogether black picture, an altogether dark picture, sorry, of what things are like. But one of the things that futurologists get wrong is that they tend to think, oh well, artificial intelligence in 2050, we'll be able to do whatever it is we can do, and they tend to forget that actually this is taking place in the context of a huge number of external factors as well. So that's not to be forgotten. I mean, those things are actually really liable to overwhelm. I mean, those are all huge global crises that are coming, and we have to try to sort everything out. I mean, this technology that I'm talking about can be fantastic in helping to tackle these problems. These are huge problems. At the moment, of course, it's not being used in that way, but we do have the opportunity to do that. But we shouldn't think, oh, what we do is just like is going to decide everything. That the world will stay the same while we make our minds up about it. So. Very briefly, what can engineers do? Well, I'm not going to tell you what to do because that would be kind of really presumptuous of me. But here are some options of things that we can think about. One of them is personal resistance, and by that I don't mean lying down in the office in front of the CEO and coming in. I mean personal resistance to these devices. I mean one thing that you can do. I failed to do it, to be honest, is to leave that phone in your pocket. The number of times that people handle their phone on an average day, it's literally hundreds. And the number of times you consult it, I mean, it's literally dozens or scores. So personal resistance, and not to click on that stupid link about an argument over a patio, but to actually read the article about the fish. So that would be something to do. Tech Won't Build It is a movement that you may have heard of. Now, this is more like lying down in front of the CEO, but not entirely. So, for example, recently Google convened an advanced technology external advisory council to talk about the ethics of AI. And this crashed immediately. It was just it never went anywhere. And the reason was because there was a revolt from Google employees because one of the people that was put on this Advanced Technology External Advisory Council was the president of the Heritage Foundation, who had a record of transphobia and anti-LGBT advocacy. And they said The letter that was written to Google management that sank this council because of their appointment of this woman, they said, the potential harms of AI are not evenly distributed and follow historical patterns of discrimination and exclusion. From AI that doesn't recognize trans people, doesn't hear more feminine voices, and doesn't see women of color, to AI used to enhance police surveillance, profile immigrants, and automate weapons. Those who are most marginalized are most at risk. I wouldn't normally read that out to you because like any academic could write that, or I could write that, but this is coming actually from Google employees, organized as Google employees. So that's not nothing in my view. They recognize that, like it or not, we all have to recognize software engineering is social engineering now. I mean, you can ignore that if you want, you can just go to work for another firm or something, but that is the case. Okay, 1 minute more. Innovation within the tech sector. So Tim Berners-Lee is developing a technology which is designed to give you control over your personal data. That's a possibility. It's called personal something, but I can't remember. PODs they are. So they're repositories of data that you control and you allow to be shared as much as you want. You could collaborate outside the tech sector because there are a lot of people thinking about this stuff and they need software engineers to illuminate their ignorance, because a lot of the time when people talk about this stuff, if they're not in the industry, they are so ignorant that it's kind of embarrassing. We can help them. And last of all, be open-minded. You're going to need to be open-minded because you're going to see an awful lot of changes. I mean, I've talked about my working life has spanned roughly the introduction of from the start of microprocessors until now. Your working lives are going to see much more change than I've seen. So you need to be alert and ready and open to new ideas. And that's really the kind of the best I can do for guidance. Here's some further reading. This is a very small sample. Of course, the science fiction is stuff I really like. But this book, Future Politics. Actually, of all the things I read for background for this talk, this book, I have to say, is really, really comprehensive. It's written by a barrister who actually really gets information technology and what's happening. And he's not yet 30. How irritating is that? Thank you very much.